It's time for our Thing of the Day, and tonight it's our tragic comedy of the day. The comedy part is Bassem Youssef. He's the Egyptian TV satirist who's often compared with Jon Stewart. The tragedy, he's been arrested for ridiculing Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. The kind of political mockery we here in America do as competitive sport. But then it turns to comedy again, as Youssef handles the arrest by wearing a hat exactly like the one Morsi famously wore recently in Pakistan, and tweeting that police and prosecutors were begging to get their pictures taken with him. A quick note to President Morsi, if you throw a tantrum when people laugh at you, they laugh even harder. 2 Saturdays ago, the U.S. Senate voted in favor of a non-binding, non-essential amendment to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. And this Saturday, a pipeline traveling through Mayflower, Arkansas, ruptured, spilling at least 12,000 barrels of oil and water all over a suburban neighborhood. What a difference a week can make, hopefully. The spill from Exxon's Pegasus pipeline, which carries crude oil from Illinois to Texas, has caused 22 homes to be evacuated in Mayflower, and officials are still trying to survey the total breadth and cost of the damage, as well as how long it's going to take to repair and clean up. Now, this marks at least the 3rd major pipeline spill in this country in the past 2 years, including one into the Yellowstone River in Montana and another in Wisconsin, clearly illustrating that the only possible solution to these environmental threats: build more pipelines. For more on the impact of this Arkansas oil spill and the effects it could have on the Keystone XL decision, I'm thrilled to be joined by Bob Kavnar, CEO of clean energy production company Luca Technologies, and a 30-year oil industry vet who is author of Disaster on the Horizon: High Stakes, High Risks, and the Story Behind the Deepwater Well Blowout. And joining us via Skype is the brilliant and vital environmentalist and founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for coming back on Viewpoint tonight. Bill, great to have you both. Bill, let me start with you. Should we be surprised when we hear about these spills like the one in Arkansas, or is this just the price we have to pay of having these pipelines crisscross our country?
You should be shocked. I mean, shocked. How could it ever spill? The first Keystone pipeline that they built spilled 12 times in 12 months. The thing to know about this Pegasus pipeline in Arkansas that spilled yesterday, it's 1/10 the size of Keystone XL. If those pictures were of Keystone XL spilling, it wouldn't be a river of oil running down the street. It would be a Niagara of oil running down the street. Look, this is why it's unbelievable folly to put a huge pipeline over the Oglala Aquifer. You're just asking for trouble.
Indeed. And Bob, why does it seem to you like we're having more of these pipeline spills now than ever? As I mentioned before, this is at least the 3rd, I think, in the past 2 years.
Well, there's a couple of things going on here, John. Obviously, we pay a lot more attention now to these kinds of things, at least people outside of the industry do, since the blowout of the BP well and the 5 million barrels of oil that was released into the Gulf. So people are a lot more attuned to these kinds of issues. But also what's going on is that we are producing more and more oil through some of the new horizontal wells domestically. So we're moving a lot more oil domestically between wells and refineries and then back to the markets. So you'll see more and more of this.
Well, Bill, let me ask, and I'll ask you as well, Bob, but Bill, do you think that this spill will have any impact on the president's decision over the Keystone XL pipeline? I mean, do you think this is making any of the senators who voted for it last week think twice?
Well, it should. The sort of nonchalance with which people have approached this entire issue, from the issue of spills of oil onto the land to the issue of spilling carbon into the atmosphere, is really appalling. I mean, our greatest climate scientist, Jim Hansen, who about an hour ago announced his retirement after 42 years from NASA, he said 18 months ago now, burn this stuff on top of everything else we're burning, and it's game over for the climate. You would think that might have gotten somebody's attention. Sooner or later, all these things are going to add up, and people are going to realize what unnecessary folly this is.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, you know, Bob, we've heard the president talk about the dangers long-term of the internal combustion engine, how it's 20th century technology. Do you think that he or our legislators in Congress may be swayed by disasters like we just saw in Arkansas?
You know, John, unfortunately, I just don't. We are in a cycle of find it, produce it, burn it, find it, produce it, burn it. And we're burning 20 million barrels of oil a day and about 68 BCF of natural gas a day. And none of our our political leaders are focused on what is the next step to get us off of that. The only way we get off the cycle of burning oil and burning natural gas, frankly, is reducing the demand for those hydrocarbons, but without taking it out of the economy. We have to move towards a policy of putting renewables on the same level playing field as hydrocarbons, and our leaders just haven't done that.
Yeah, Bill, do you think there's any chance of that happening in the next 2 years before a midterm election?
I think that there's a chance that we can still stop this pipeline, and that will help. We're trying to raise 1 million public comments over the next 14 days before the State Department finishes its environmental impact statement. It'd be a pretty good public comment just to send in a picture of that mess in Arkansas. If you go to 350.org, we've got it all set up so you can do it easily. Look, this is a real line in the tar sands, as it were. Time magazine said Keystone had become the Selma and the Stonewall of the climate fight. So we're not going to give up easily.
Before we move on to fracking, which I do want to ask about, I have one last question. What's the biggest piece of disinformation you guys have heard repeated about Keystone? Bob, let me start with you.
Well, there's actually some, I believe, disinformation on both sides of this issue. On the industry side, they like to talk about jobs and how it improves the economy and all of those things that hit all the buttons with the Republicans. But in fact, it really doesn't add that many jobs. In construction, it does, but once it's completed, there are very few jobs there at all. I think the challenge on the progressive side is the thought that we just can't do this. We have to stop this. And when private businesses are operating on a profit motive, it's very difficult just to get the politicians to stop an activity. So the challenge here is to price all of the costs into every bit of energy we have, so everything is more of a level playing field. And I think that's where we need to drive towards, rather than arguing over jobs versus where the oil particularly goes in a certain day.
Right. Well, and that's another big point, Bill. One of the biggest myths I keep hearing is about how this will drive gas prices down in America. What's the biggest myth that you keep hearing about Keystone, and how do you respond to it?
Well, the biggest myth is that it's inevitable. A year ago, everybody was saying, oh, well, if we don't build Keystone, the Canadians will build a pipeline to the Pacific and send the oil to China that way. But people in Canada have risen up in their hundreds and their thousands, and they have blocked that pipeline. No one thinks it's going to get built anytime soon. All we're going to find out now is whether the U.S. are the real chumps here or not, whether we'll take all the damage so we can get this stuff across our country and exported from refineries on the Gulf Coast.
Well, let's move to something lighter like fracking. Bob, you wrote a great piece for Huffington Post about one of the dangers of fracking not just being what we're putting in the ground, but what we're putting in the air as well. Can you explain?
Hydraulic fracturing is a combination of several processes. One is it's pumping a gelled water. It's a slick water that has a friction reducer in it, but also a gel that holds sand in suspension. And it combines sand and this slick water down and pumps it into the wells. When that gel breaks from heat, when the water is flowed back and the chemicals that were with it, the sand stays in place, and when the fracture closes that was created, it's actually propped open by that sand. The problem with sand is it's particulate, it's silica. And I was on frac crews when I was a kid many, many years ago, and we didn't even wear respirators. Today they're wearing respirators, but they're pumping so much sand, they're moving so much sand that it's exposing the residences around these frac sites, these drilling sites, and the crews themselves. A lot of these crews work more than 12 hours a day in this environment on a continuous basis.
And Bill, before we go, I want to ask, what do you make of former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell writing an op-ed in the Daily News here in New York supporting fracking, but failing to mention his deep ties to the industry? Is this depressingly common?
Yeah, this is pretty much how it works. And you know what the story in New York today is? New study demonstrating that all that frack gas is running through Con Ed pipes so leaky that a lot of it's escaping straight out into the atmosphere, where it's driving climate change too. We used to think that frack gas was going to be some kind of bridge to the future, but it's clear it's just one more rickety fossil fuel pier, stretching out into this hydrocarbon lake. Time to put up the windmills and the solar panels and get onto it.
Gentlemen, I thank you both for fighting so hard for America. CEO of clean energy production company Luca Technologies, Bob Kavnar, and essential environmentalist and founder of 350.org, Bill McKibben. Again, thank you both so much for your time and insights this evening. Always a pleasure to have you both.
Take care, gentlemen.
Thank you. Okay, we continue our series, WTF America, and this week we're doing the state of Idaho, where they're finally standing up to fictional characters. That's ahead.